The notion of a Hermetic philosophical, spiritual, and religious tradition has become an important anchor in the lives of practitioners of Western esotericism, even if the notion has been met recently with not a little scholarly criticism. From Freemasonry, Wicca, ceremonial and ritual magicians, the New Age movement, Thelemites, the world of Enochian practice, and especially Neoplatonists and of course self-identified Hermeticists out there, there remains an idea of a Hermetic thread through the Romantic and occult revivals of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, back to philosophers and mages like Agrippa, Bruno, Pico, Ficino, and also to the Solomonic grimoire tradition and the occult sciences, which reach all the way back into the haze of the Middle Ages. Though I think most would agree that a decisive moment in this history was the publication of the Corpus Hermeticum, the collected teachings of the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, taken to be the founder of a religious philosophy, along with alchemy, magic, astrology, and more, in the famed, though corrupt Latin translation of Marsilio Ficino. There, at least in a very significant way, in the ferment of late 15th century Italy, began the seeds of what became known as the Hermetic tradition, with all the necessary caveats that come along with that concept, or just Western esotericism more generally. But who was the first philosopher and mage of this period to actually fully identify with the Hermetic philosophy? The answer may be surprising. It wasn't Ficino or Pico or even Giordano Bruno. It was the poet Lodovico Lazzarelli that first referred to themselves as a Hermetist or Hermeticist, and thus likely became the first Hermetic philosopher in European history. In this episode, I want to explore what is, by extension, the first true work of European Hermetic philosophy, Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis, or the Mixing Bowl of Hermes, where he will reveal the most controversial aspect of the Hermetic teachings in the Renaissance, the process of God creation. If you're interested in magic, Hermetic, or occult philosophy, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I do appreciate you considering supporting the channel and the project of Esoterica. Also, if you're not familiar with the Corpus Hermeticum and the classical Hermetic philosophy, you may want to check out my episode on that topic in the card above before diving really headlong into this episode. But now let's turn to the first self-styled Hermetic philosopher or Hermetist or Hermeticist, Ludovico Lazzarelli, and the wonderfully profound Crater Hermetis. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. In our world, one has perhaps one of the most unique privileges in history. One can seek out one's own spiritual, philosophical system and religious path. One can mix and blend paths, zig and zag, convert, deconvert, abandon, augment, and adapt various strands into something so syncretic that it only tracks to oneself, a true spiritual and religious idiolect. As you might imagine, for most of history, such a way of being was unimaginable, and sometimes even minor deviation from the religious hegemony of the day could mean ruin, torture, and death. In many ways, that lack of latitude of practice also had to do with the lack of viable alternatives, either in practice or in the literature of the time. The reintroduction of such religious, philosophical, and spiritual alternatives, at least at the literary level, began to appear in the late 15th century. Specifically, I'm referring to the reintroduction of the pagan religious and philosophical wisdom of luminaries such as Plato, Plotinus, Proclus, Iamblichus, and of course the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus in translations principally like those of Marsilio Ficino. Such ancient pagan wisdom, especially what was taken to be the utterly primordial wisdom of the Hermetic philosophy, allowed for the possibility that spiritual and philosophical elevation could have occurred prior to the coming of Christ and the Church, and maybe even before Moses. Thus, the embryonic possibility that such elevation, perhaps salvation and supernatural, even magical powers, could be achieved without the mediation of the Church. This notion was as alluring as it was provocative and downright dangerous. In Florence, Ficino and his circle began to theorize such magical and illuminatory practices, specifically marshalling Plato and Plotinus. But note who's missing. Despite the translation of the Hermetic text by Ficino, which is honestly a bit of a mess, he never really centered the Corpus Hermeticum in his religious, philosophical, and magical projects. And in many ways, neither did those luminaries that we now associate with the Hermetic philosophy of that time. People like Pico, Giordano Bruno, Cornelius Agrippa, or John Dee. Yes, Hermetic adjacent, but for none of these thinkers was the teachings found in the Corpus Hermeticum itself really front and center. So why do we so strongly associate them with Hermetic philosophy? Mostly because of the monumental studies of folks like Dame Frances Yates, D.P. Walker, and other scholars in the mid-20th century Warburg School, for whom just such thinkers, especially Bruno, were cast to be the decisive Hermetic precursors of scientific modernity. Now, this line of thinking has come under sustained criticism in the past few decades, and what has emerged, ironically, is an actual self-styled Hermetic philosopher. In fact, the very first philosopher to refer to themselves as an Hermetist or a Hermeticist so far known in history, especially European history, Lodovico Lazzarelli, with his De Summa Hominis Dignitate Dialogos qui inscribitur via Christi et Crater Hermetis, or a dialogue on the supreme dignity of man entitled The Way of Christ and the Mixing Bowl of Hermes, being truly the first work of Hermetic philosophy in Europe produced since late antiquity. That the first modern Hermetic philosopher and work of Hermetic philosophy is basically unknown even to many scholars of religion and philosophy, but also even to those who identify as practicing in the Hermetic tradition proves surprising, maybe even shocking. So let's try to remedy that at least a bit. Lazzarelli was born in 1447 and as early as 13 was already winning prizes for his poetic skills. His early life was, like so many of such poets of the time, rather itinerant, moving around and publishing work in the hopes of securing patronage. Hey, Lazzarelli, on that whole trying to get patronage angle, just know. Well, we're slipping back into feudalism, it seems. That aside, this isn't exactly clear where Lazzarelli first came into contact with Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. It was perhaps in manuscripts as early as the 1460s, though the first Hermetic elements actually appear in his Fasti Christianae e Religionis, which it seems remained a work in progress for many years. Though certainly his familiarity with the text is established by 1482, and he seems to have not only come to know the ideas of the Corpus Hermeticum, but he seems to have been identifying with those teachings as well. He was becoming a Hermetic philosopher. Indeed, at some point, and no one understands exactly when this happened, Lazzarelli came into possession with a version of either manuscript B or perhaps N or one of their children, which contained all 17 Hermetic logoi in Greek, translating them for the first time into Latin. In fact, they appear in the second edition of the translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is far superior, though less popular, than the defective Ficino translation. And it was around this time that the prophet Correggio made his first of many bizarre appearances throughout Italy. When I say bizarre, I mean so bonkers that early historians didn't even think this guy existed because the stories about him were just so crazy. For reasons that aren't terribly clear, again, Lazzarelli became both a disciple and a kind of Hermetic teacher of Correggio, introducing the apocalyptic prophet to Hermetic ideas. In fact, Correggio would eventually change his name to Giovanni Mercurio da Correggio and actually publicly declared himself the Angel of Wisdom, Pymander, a reference to the divine being that illuminated none less than Hermes Trismegistus himself in Corpus Hermeticum 1. Now, I don't have the time to describe the over-the-top Hermetic apocalyptic prophetic antics of Correggio, which involved everything from entering Rome on a white ass with elaborately dressed attendants, preaching judgment all the while banging on a human skull, or the other times he was forcing his wife and 5 children to don sackcloth girded with ropes and beg in the streets, all the while demanding meetings with various popes. Suffice to say, this fella Correggio made an impression on people, especially Lazzarelli, who was spending his time lecturing to aristocratic children before moving to Naples and acquiring a reputation as something little devious, a little magical, maybe even necromantic healing powers. Of course, the account of his life written by his brother refutes that he engaged in any such magical practices, but by the late 1480s and 90s, an air of occultism had become attached to Lazzarelli, and it was sometime between 1492 and 1494 that he completed his mature work of the Hermetic Philosophy. Indeed, as I pointed out, the first such European work of Hermetic philosophy, the Crater Hermetis, or the Mixing Bowl of Hermes. Even the title of this work is an immediate callback to Corpus Hermeticum 4, a discourse of Hermes to Tot, the crater or mixing bowl of the monad, and like many classical Hermetic texts, Lazzarelli's text takes the form of a dialogue. In this case, Lazzarelli is rather daring. The classical Hermetic texts take the form of a teacher, usually Hermes, teaching various students such as Tot or Ammon or Asclepius a range of metaphysical, spiritual, or cosmological teachings. Here, Lazzarelli casts himself in the role of teacher and initiator to none less than King Ferdinand of Aragon, who he was courting for patronage at the time, along with his Secretary of State and famed poet Giovanni Pontano. So, not so much with the humility there, but it does appear that Lazzarelli himself underwent some kind of profound spiritual and philosophical transmutation under the development of the Hermetic philosophical and apocalyptic preaching of Correggio. Perhaps, given just this experience, he did see himself in the position to provide just such instruction and initiation into the Hermetic mysteries. The Crater Hermetis is a rather complex dialogue interspersed with 5 hymns, one of which contains the central mystery of the text. Reading it, one is amazed by just how deftly Lazzarelli is able to synthesize content from the Bible, Neoplatonic sources, especially Pseudo-Dionysius, the Corpus Hermeticum obviously, a range of Greek myth, Philo of Alexandria, and Kabbalistic sources, including the Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar, and some, let's call them, spurious works. It's a truly ingenious text and bears many of the features that mark out both classical and Renaissance Hermeticism, but even prefigures much in the way of Christian and Hermetic Kabbalah. The Crater Hermetis begins with Lazzarelli lamenting his own spiritual anguish in an attempt to gain at the true felicity given the various confused paths he's come upon in life. His solution came when the divine Pymander, yes, the divine Pymander, the same being that seems to have illuminated Hermes Trismegistus in Corpus Hermeticum 1, takes up residence in Lazzarelli's soul. Shockingly, the text then actually identifies the divine Pymander with Christ, an identification unheard of, to my knowledge, before or really since. Having been illuminated just as Hermes, Lazzarelli takes on the role of Hierophant and seeks to provide such an illumination to King Ferdinand or Ferrante and the poet-politician Cardano as students, and, of course, the readers as well. Here he introduces that, again, echoing the classical Hermetic literature, that he will not employ Greek-style rhetoric, but the active power of Egyptian words. Though not Egyptian in the linguistic metaphysical sense, as are discussed in the classical Hermetic corpus, but here in the sense of teachings which flow from Egypt via Hermes. Indeed, for Lazzarelli and many later Hermetic philosophers, Hermes Trismegistus was both the progenitor of exoteric but also the esoteric philosophies, teaching those to both the Hebrews via Moses and the Greeks via figures like Pythagoras. The key to this inner illumination begins with the classic admonition to know thyself, or that self-knowledge is the first step in this process. Though, again, not according to a Greek understanding of this concept, but according to the more primordial Egyptian Hermetic understanding. In fact, it's here in the text that Cardano, or Pantano as he appears in the dialogue, counters that Lazzarelli too highly praises Hermes, even over Greek and Mosaic wisdom, with Lazzarelli noting Christianus sum et Hermeticum sum simul esse non pudent. I am a Christian, but I'm not ashamed to be a Hermetist as well, going on to point out that there is no fundamental clash in the two. In fact, the truth of Christianity, according to Lazzarelli, is perfectly prefigured in the ancient teachings of Hermes. And it's here that he discusses the admonition to know thyself precisely as a theological rather than a psychological or even inner spiritual matter. To know thyself is to know thy inner divine nature. Thus, the first hymn is a truly Hermetic invocation for divine blessing for this teaching. To know thyself is to know thy divine origin and how one came to be in this fallen, ignorant, and sinful state. Thus begins a long exegetical section where Lazzarelli argues gliding effortlessly between biblical, Hermetic, and other philosophical and spiritual texts, that it was by letting the physical world of the body become the exclusive center of our attention that our true divine nature is effaced and forgotten. Physical reality and our physical bodies aren't inherently evil, but if our contemplation of their beauty or pleasure doesn't point us in the direction of divine goodness, sublime beauty, and spiritual pleasure, such worldly contemplation becomes a trap that we build, place ourselves into, and spring upon ourselves. What's fascinating here is comparing Lazzarelli to Ficino on exactly this point. Whereas a very similar point was made by Ficino by leaning on Plato and Plotinus, Lazzarelli displays his truly Hermetic angle here by leaning heavily on a comparative reading of biblical accounts, using the Corpus Hermeticum as a kind of constant hermeneutical lens, moving between the two trees in the Garden of Eden, the wise and alien woman in the book of Proverbs, or the giants and the little ones which Jesus called to be brought to him. Lazzarelli using the idea that any positive and negative pairs imply the other hermeneutically, and he manages to provide a systematically Hermetic philosophical take on otherwise well-trodden biblical texts. And it's truly stunning to see, to be honest. The Bible is subsumed under his Hermetic agenda, which, again, shouldn't be a totally surprising move. For Lazzarelli, Hermes was the teacher of Moses, and thus biblical teachings are, in fact, Hermetic teachings made to speak Hebrew. While this part of the text can feel like a bit of an unneeded detour on the way to the more truly Hermetic, mysterious ideas, it's a tour de force of Hermetic biblical hermeneutics, which shows just the degree to which Lazzarelli was truly developing a Hermetic Christianity, or perhaps better, a Christian Hermeticism. Following this exegetical discursus, Lazzarelli returns to the central focus, the Hermetic vision of what it means to know thyself. Specifically here, he foreshadows the inner mystery of the concept. Not only does it mean recognizing one's inner divine nature, but it also is somehow linked to the very generative power of the divine itself, here linking Corpus Hermeticum 1:18 with the famed admonition at Genesis 1:22 and 28 to be fruitful and multiply. More on this in just a moment. As I mentioned, this is the core of Lazzarelli's Hermetic teaching, but at this point we're only given it as a kind of clue or lore. However, before we can realize our divine nature, we must take stock of our current fallen condition. Lazzarelli cites the Corpus Hermeticum that rather than focusing on the contemplation of the unchanging divine, we've turned to contemplation of generation, change, and illusion. Our bodies, once sanctified by the holy power of the divine, are now the haunts of the demonic. That the failure of Adam made possible for human beings to descend into darkness by becoming overly attached to the physical world, but it's we who daily actualize this potential with our failure to attain to our true divine selves. While baptism temporarily beats back the dark, it's our own task to complete our own inner illumination. And this inaugurates the second hymn, or the sad complaint, lamenting our fallen state. However, this lamentation finished, we are now beginning our ascent out of the darkness. To attain to our inner divinity is possible, according to Lazzarelli, because God has created us, of course, in the divine image. Thus, just as we can know the identity of a ruler on a coin by recognizing the real ruler, so too does our recognition of our inner divinity rely on our knowledge of God. Here, Lazzarelli rejects both the more typical Platonic and Christian notions that our bodies are fundamentally fleshy cages marked by their fallenness and sin. Rather, just as the physical world is the Son of God and human beings are nothing short of miracles in the Hermetic literature, so too does Lazzarelli afford dignity to both the inner soul of the human being, but also to the physical body, just so long as both of those are turned in their fullness of attainment to their inner divinity and inner knowledge. Again, recall that the subtitle of the Crater Hermetis is a dialogue on the supreme dignity of man in both physical and spiritual respects. In fact, Lazzarelli turns to the Kabbalah to explain the nature of the soul itself. It's nothing less than the very light of God. We come to know our true selves by recognizing the true nobility of our status as having been made not only in the image of God, but by realizing who we really are. Our inner soul is nothing less than a localized aspect of the divine. This realization allows us our metaphysical ascent to quote that transcendent and most shining darkness of God, a phrase that rings simultaneously with Hermetic, Areopagitic, and Kabbalistic overtones. A truly remarkable synthesis. Also, if you're wondering where Lazzarelli picked up his Kabbalah, it seems that one of the more likely sources was the same font that slaked Pico's thirst. Johannan Alameno. I've done a whole episode on Johannan Alameno and his Renaissance Kabbalistic Study Guide if you want to check that out in the card above. This section inaugurates in the Crater Hermetis the onset of ecstasy on the part of both the protagonists and the readers as their souls start to experience elevation given the active Egyptian words of Lazzarelli's teaching. The language here shifts from intellectual discursive narratives to an increasingly ecstatic emotional experience, with the power of love rather than knowledge becoming increasingly central. The third hint of contemplation is the diving board or rocket pad, depending on the metaphorical direction you want to imagine going, into the hidden Hermetic mystery at the core of the text. Having arrived at the, quote, outer courts of the darkness where God dwells, and by revealing the mystery, he bids them and us to enter into, quote, God's most lucid darkness. What then is the mystery? It's the dual fecundity of the divine fertility of which human beings, in that they too are a kind of God, can share. Just as the divine androgyne can create a universe of angels and demons, sky, earth, and water, so too can the fully realized human being emulate the divine and also call forth being from nothingness in a pure blending of magic and theurgy. Here, Lazzarelli is at his absolutely most bold. Carefully interpreting the first commandment given in the Bible, be fruitful and multiply, as not merely the generation of biological children, nor even the fruitfulness of mental production of brilliant ideas, Lazzarelli argues that the commandment is actually for the production of other spiritual beings. This is imitatio Dei of the highest order, that human beings can create just as God does, from physical children to spiritual entities. And even more daring, Lazzarelli accomplishes this by leaning on, and in fact centering, the most controversial section of the surviving Corpus Hermeticum, the famous sections of God creation at Aesculapius 23 through 24 and 37 through 38. Sections that were so shocking to Renaissance Christians that the phrase lapsus hermetis had to be inserted into some of the printed editions. Even Ficino, hiding a bit behind Plotinus, had to argue that this drawing down of celestial forces into substances was utterly natural, and such magic was licit precisely because it did not animate, much less create, other beings. Lazzarelli goes much, much further, again relying not only on Hermetic literature, but also on a Kabbalistic interpretation of the Sefer Yetzirah, where Abraham himself is said to have created souls at Haran at Genesis 12:5. His fourth hymn of divine generation describes the innermost Hermetic mystery of knowing thyself as not only recognizing one's divine nature, but also activating one's divinity by literally creating spiritual beings, just as Abraham and God did. In fact, these sections transport the reader to places in biblical history where human beings were transfigured into holy spiritual beings, whereby they themselves might recognize their own inner divinity and begin the process of spiritual creation. But how? Lazzarelli informs the king that it's getting late, and with a warning about the evils of certain kinds of magic culled from the Sefer Zohar, yet all the while affirming his own Hermetic, Kabbalistic, Christian theurgical practices, says that just how to engage in divine creation will have to wait for a further teaching. Maybe when he gets that patronage gig. And with a final apocalyptic hymn of praise to the divine Pymander Christ, the Crater Hermetis comes to a dramatic cliffhanger of an ending. Oh, yeah, and it's worth mentioning that the king that Lazzarelli was courting actually died not long after the text was finished, and he tried to kind of rework it for a new king, and he just gave up. Lazzarelli himself died in 1500, and the Crater Hermetis first saw publication along with other Hermetic works starting in 1505. Sadly, the text languished largely in obscurity ever since, though Hanegraaff has actually argued very convincingly that Agrippa's entire project of the three books of occult philosophy is really only comprehensible when understood as an extension of the Hermetic philosophy of Lazzarelli. So his ideas have survived in some ways through Agrippa, though I think the text of the three books of occult philosophy is honestly more celebrated or maligned than actually understood by many people. Though, as I hope you can see, the Crater Hermetis, despite its historical obscurity, is an absolute standout in the history of Hermetic philosophy. Indeed, it's a truly Hermetic text, both in structure and content, which is sadly and tragically overshadowed by other more recent pseudo-Hermetic texts. In fact, I would forward that the Crater Hermetis remains basically unknown even to those for whom Hermetic philosophy is a spiritual path, mainly because of the vicissitudes of history and the way in which the Yeats paradigm has dominated the study of Western esotericism, at least until recently. Luckily, that is being corrected in recent decades, and Hanegraaff's and Bouthoorn's edition of the Crater Hermetis, along with many other Hermetic and alchemical and prophetic writings of both Lazzarelli and Correggio, are a welcome and refreshing addition. Sadly, it's extraordinarily difficult to find the volume outside of libraries, though I've heard rumors in the East, whispers in the shadows, that a new and expanded edition will eventually appear, and I certainly hope that comes to pass soon. This text deserves a much wider readership and recognition for its spiritual and literary value. Of course, I've only scratched the surface of the Crater Hermetis and hardly touched on the Hermetic-infused declarations of Correggio or Lazzarelli's own alchemical works, all topics perhaps for another time. Again, if you're interested in Hermetic or occult philosophy and magic, make sure to subscribe, check out my numerous other content on topics in esotericism, and again, if you find this content rewarding, please consider supporting this work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.